We now turn to our first speaker on the opposition, Frances Guy. Frances is a British former diplomat who was ambassador to Yemen and to Lebanon. She was also the UN Women's representative in Iraq. Frances, you have the floor.
Don't like you standing behind you. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, it is not for this House to regret the spirit of the Arab street. I would like to start by quoting an Egyptian protester who was interviewed by Al Jazeera 10 years after the revolution in Tahrir Square. When you are exposed to the deep and ugly face of Egypt today, you remember that you have also been exposed to its beauty, to the purity you saw in Tahrir. I keep reminding myself that it was genuine, and if it was there then, we can get it back. I would suggest to you that the premise of this motion is questionable. It's based on an idea that the spring happened and somehow it's finished, that it's over, that the situation is now worse than it might have been, as James indeed said. It ignores the reality that protests are actually ongoing, that there have been some positive outcomes on the way. There are leaders who were imprisoned. There are still leaders who are in prison in a region that is not famous for its respect of the rule of law. Military governments have been overthrown. Change has been made possible. This motion denies the importance of hope as an inspiration for populations still mired in economic despair. Given what happened last week, it's hard not to focus on the dark winter that is Syria. But the spirit of the Arab Spring did not die when Hayat Tahrir al-Sham took over the uprising from the people who dared support those young boys in Dara at the beginning. Nor did it die in the fighting in Libya. The brave men and women of Sudan started their protests in December 2018. And they persisted and persisted until a move towards civilian rule was agreed. General Omar Hassan Ahmed al-Bashir is still in prison in Khartoum, in case you had forgotten, awaiting trial. And although the transfer of power has been erratic and slow and frustrating and goes forward and backwards, it's still just about on track. The brave men and women of Algeria also persisted for nearly 3 years in their protests until Bouteflika resigned. And yes, the result is not revolutionary in terms of political change, but the peaceful protests themselves showed that Algeria could implement change in a non-violent way. In 2019, brave young men and women in Iraq also took to the streets to demonstrate their frustration at the government's failure to deliver basic services. And as in Algeria, these largely peaceful protesters were met with a tough response from the security forces. But they too persisted for months. Okay, Iraq finally has a new government. It's still very unsatisfactory and it's still not delivering. And the confidence of the people in the system has reached an all-time low. But the protests themselves are not a matter of regret, and they can be restarted again if necessary. But what about Tunisia, the spark that lit the interests of the region and beyond? Tunisia was for a while a beacon for the world, genuinely, showing how to negotiate in an inclusive and participatory fashion a new constitution, introducing a revolutionary electoral system with vertical and horizontal lists that encouraged gender parity and resulted in the election of a female mayor of Tunis and many other women leaders. It offered hope and inspiration across the region. Yes, economic problems have persisted, and yes, there is disillusionment and real doubt about the direction the country is now going in. But let's remember what that kind of doubt used to look like. In 2009, the last presidential election for Ben Ali, he was elected for a 5th term, repeat, 5th term, with 90% of the vote involving 84.5% of the electorate, despite the fact that corruption, disillusionment and imprisonment of opposition voices was already well entrenched by that stage. At the end of 2022, a few months ago, when Kais Saied tried to hold a parliamentary election to endorse the changes that he's now trying to make, 11% of the electorate turned out. The world and Said himself have to notice the people of Tunisia are still making their voices heard in a peaceful, persuasive way. This story, ladies and gentlemen, is not finished. The metaphorical winter in Yemen and Syria is brutal. The hopes raised by protests in both places, and let's not forget those very brave Yemeni women who stood in the streets while we look on as the Houthis crack down Taliban style on women's rights. Those hopes raised in Yemen and Syria have been turned into painful, intractable conflicts fueled by outside interventions. Political reality in Libya is brutal, but there's still some dialogue and discussion that never existed before. Foreign intervention there too has been continuously exacerbating tensions. So generally, let's not forget that one of the principal reasons for a dependent political culture and dysfunctional economies across the region is the result of colonial intervention and continued political, economic and military interference. So no, this House should not regret the Arab Spring. It's ongoing and it expresses the voice of the Arab people. And as one of the songs on the album just released by Acid Arab goes, freedom is the word of the people. Thank you.